Well, and with the use of the spectrograms and whatnot too, like it'd be hard for you to miss stuff because your mixes are fantastic. Like your mixes are world class. And I've said that many times, and I'll still say it as long as you continue to make amazing mixes. That I have, and that's what when it comes to producing homemade music, that's what separates the I don't want to say have-nots and have-beens or whatever the phrase is, because we don't really have anything other than our music. But I mean like when I can share my music with somebody and they're surprised that it sounds so good, knowing it came out of my basement, that's how I know I'm doing a good job. Yeah. They're like, "Whoa, this doesn't sound like homemade music." And I'm like, "Well, good. It's not supposed to. It should. I want it to sound like it belongs on the shelf at the record store, whether or not it's there or not." And you've achieved that years ago. Like the mixes that when I go back through your catalog, the stuff from the '90s and everything like that, like it sounds great. Like it's
that's amazing. That's amazing to me because I've never had. Back in those days, I didn't have the kit. The only people I knew were people I was working with. I didn't ever, because of the kind of person I am and the sort of autism and all that shit, I never reached out to like ordinary people. The only people I knew were people I was working with, and they were either part of it, so they had no perspective, or they were jealous.
Yeah.
They were like, "Oh, it's not as good as Bowie, or it's not as good as Zappa, or whatever." So it's very gratifying to hear you say that you think those mixes are good. I always thought they were good, but I always worried that there was something missing. And I remember there's an album I did. It wasn't an album at the time. It has since become an album. It's called A Room Full of Fish, which I did with a guy who was. Oh God, what's his name? Oh Christ, I don't remember his name. But Nick, a guy called Nick, who was a keyboard player, and we sort of messed about with samples and stuff like that. And he took one of the mixes that we'd made, and he put it into his. He was the barman at a club, a famous club in Edinburgh, and he played it in the club, and he said it was terrible. All I could hear was the bass. I couldn't hear any of the other instruments, and that made me pause. I remember thinking, "Wow," because there's a completely different thing that comes with volume, and that has since been remastered. I remastered everything in about 2014 when I got everything up onto Bandcamp, so I remastered it properly. But for a long time, those mixes that you hear were never mastered. They were. I mean, we sold a few CDs and things like that of unmastered stuff. So I was very aware at that time that I was worried, shit, all my mixes might be terrible. I might not have a clue what I'm doing. And maybe everybody that's commenting is just in on the joke sort of thing, do you know what I mean? They're all laughing at me behind my back. So it's very gratifying to hear you say all these years later, that those mixes work quite well. And I think they do. I think they work quite well now that they're remastered and presented properly. I think that's one of the things that I think many people miss is the importance of the finalization of the mix and the mastering, because you can get to 80% of your mix pretty quickly, but then you've got that 20% to go, and then you've got the cherry on the cake, which is the mastering. It has to kind of finish it all off. And I think a lot of what I hear from a lot of sort of amateur productions is that bit is missing, that extra. What Frank Zappa used to call putting the eyebrows on it. Just the little sort of details, the little flecks of colour that make it all suddenly make sense. I don't know how you could teach that other than to let people know that's what you do. That you look for these little extra bits. Yeah.
Now, one thing I've noticed with my mixes, my music, and like my satisfaction with them is if I take a look at, say, there's all these things swirling in my head. Hopefully I get too distracted here, but like say Devin Townsend, for example. When I first started listening to Devin Townsend's music, it's mixed and mastered in a way that I've never heard music done before. Like he has his own thing going on, and that's a thread through all of his albums. And whether he's mixing it or someone else is mixing it, the way he records his vocals and his guitar is like he likes to layer a lot of things. It's really like Devin Townsend took the wall of sound idea that Phil Spector invented and rewrote the rules.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? Because when someone says wall of sound, I don't think Phil Spector. I think Devin Townsend now, right? And then so so when I started trying to make heavy metal music, he was the guy I was trying to emulate, was Devin Townsend, right? But then I hear Devin Townsend talk about the disappointment. He doesn't like those mixes. He thinks they sound limp and sort of, they fall short, right? Because for him, he wanted to sound like Metallica. And he's like, it doesn't sound like, he's like, Bob Rock mixes from Metallica sound better. And he's like, when I hear them on FM radio, they hit the compressor of the FM radio differently than my music does. And it's like, and he talks about how obsessed Bob Rock is with like the cymbals he picks and the mic positions and how he's so good at what he does. But so Devin Townsend can't sound like Metallica. He can't figure it out. But in the interim though, he managed to make a sound that to me sounds like, I'd rather sound like Devin than Metallica. Right? So Devin's created a sound through his own experimentation and what he thinks are failures, made something to me that is more, hits me deeper in a way that I like. So that being said, for me, like in my music, where I feel I fall the shortest is when I'm playing heavy metal type stuff, or if I'm leaning towards like a dance music kind of sound. Like I don't make dance music, but you've heard it. Like I like the kick drum to be louder than most rock music is. I like the kick drum to hit you like a fucking hammer, right? I often will have the kick drum be twice as loud as the rest of the drum kit, because like the cymbals to me are just like, they're there because they add some treble and they fill out the high end. Otherwise I wouldn't hit them. Like I don't like cymbals. I think cymbals are a waste of time. but there's not a lot happening up there. So the cymbals, they do a good job up there, right? Whereas the bass drum exists in the middle of everything else. Like it's like a fucking freight train running through the mix, right? So I struggle to make that bass sit where I want it to all the time. Like I'm always I always have mixes that hit the mark. I got mixes that don't hit the mark. And sometimes I struggle to figure out what it is I missed. But when I decide to pull my music back and I play from my heart and I make like there's this thing that happens in my songs that I'm completely aware of, but like almost all my songs have what I would call, or my friend Drew would call, they melt, right? Like we'll have a song that starts off, I like the beginning of my songs to usually be catchy because I want to bring the listener in. And then I spend a minute or two giving you like pop rhythms and pop melodies and lyrics and stuff. Not all the time, but that's a common, especially recently. And then 2 minutes into the song, it devolves into something completely different. And it's usually very chaotic. It's melty, like things are melting out of tune and in tune. There's, who gives a shit about this 12-note spectrum shit? I'm using 64 notes now, right? And it's like microtonal to the point of like not making sense. And it's like this, it's supposed to be disorientating. It's supposed to be like a spot where your brain leaves your body and you're like not listening to music anymore. The music becomes the background to your meditation, right? And when I make that stuff, when I listen back to the mixes, that's where the music shines the best, where it sounds better, it fills the spectrum better. And I realized that, so what I do best is what I do best, right? So I'm not Devin Townsend, I'm not Trent Reznor, I'm not Metallica. So if I try and sound like those guys, I fall short. I probably could work harder and figure out how to mix and master and probably get there. And every time I do try, I do get closer to the desired effect. But the effortless parts of my mixes are the parts where I'm being me.
That's because you're an original. You're It's interesting. Devin Townsend tried to emulate or tried to get close to the sound of Metallica, and Metallica is a very straightforward, kind of like AC/DC kind of. It's the instrumentation is the live instrumentation. There's not much in the way of overdubs, and I think Metallica made a great bones at one point of not doing overdubs, not using any reverb, all that kind of stuff. It was a very dry, very in-your-face sound. Along comes Devin Townsend, tries to get close to that, realises he can't do it by just miking up one guitar, so he layers in another guitar, and he's got all the different layers, and it all becomes very dense and very kind of like monolithic. It's all the colours all the time. That's the way it sounds to me anyway. And then you come along as another original, and you hear Devin Townsend and go, I want to do that. So you're copying the guy who tried to copy Metallica, and you're discovering that that's more difficult than you thought. But when you actually go towards your original stuff, the stuff that comes out of you without you attempting to emulate anybody else, you find the realism that really works for you, and that's because you're not a copyist.